Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for putting up with going back to online for a little bit. Sorry for the inconvenience. Quick announcement before we start. So for the last day of class, which is going to be on June 1st, that is the Wednesday after next week. I just wanted to make a quick announcement. We're going to have an EV showcase. I basically asked a bunch of colleagues and friends who have different EVs to come bring them, and you guys can come check out all these different vehicles, and it'll be over at our main institute, which is behind in one of the parking lots in West Village, behind this address, 1605 Tilia Street. Yeah, and there'll be free pizza there. It's optional, right? This isn't like a mandatory participation or anything, but kind of as a way to finish up the class. Yeah, if you want to show up, yeah, feel free. Extra credit? Yes, maybe. I'll think about it. Okay. Any questions about that? Yeah, it'll be at the regular class time, so just 5 o'clock on Wednesday. So you guys shouldn't have anything else to do at that time, theoretically. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about CAFE and greenhouse gas emission standards. On Monday with Dan, he kind of walked you through some of the ZEV regulation, which is coming out of the state of California, right? And this regulation is less specific to electric vehicles, although it does play an important role. And it is at the federal level. So we'll talk about kind of the history of these standards and how they've influenced efficiencies of gas cars, and sort of how they relate to the adoption and the technology for electric vehicles as well. And I should also mention, I'm trying to keep the lecture a little bit shorter today because I've kind of lost my voice. So we won't go probably the full time. Okay. So I don't think that Dan had talked about this on Monday, but it was a topic that I had wanted to cover. So thinking about different types of laws. And this is true both in the state level in California as well as the federal level. So when we think of laws, I think a lot of people are probably a little bit more familiar with the legislative process, which is how elected officials, right? So at the federal level, we're thinking of members of Congress, either elected legislators in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. They can essentially introduce laws, and it goes through this whole process of going through different committees, getting passed to the other sort of the other body, the other legislative body. So if it's someone, the House, who's introducing a bill, then it has to go through the Senate as well, and similar that's a similar process that happens at the state level as well. And there's a whole variety of ways that these laws can fail, right? They can fail on the floor, within the committees, in the other legislative body. But eventually, if it makes it through all of that, it's finalized when it gets signed by the president at the federal level or by the governor at the state level. And that has, right, the full sort of force of law behind it. But there's actually a different process through which laws can be made as well. And that's through regulatory bodies. And so these are at the state level, the one that you guys probably talked about last time, right? The California Air Resources Board, which is responsible for the ZEV regulation. But at the federal level, you know, there's a whole bunch of different agencies that can do this. And the process through which a regulation is made is fairly different. Okay, generally what happens is a federal agency will say, hey, we're going to make a new regulation on a specific topic. So here is an initial rulemaking that we've made, and they release it out to the public. And then the public can then make comments on the rule. And this is during a period known as a public commenting period. And that period is usually a couple months long, and maybe a couple weeks sort of at the very shortest. Okay, and so keep that in mind as we think about the regulation, forming the regulation. Oh, sorry, I see a quick question in chat. So there isn't going to be any there isn't a participation poll for this. I can actually just see who's on Zoom, so don't worry about missing a poll for this. Okay, so the regulation, once it gets through the open comment period, then goes back to the regulatory agency, and then they basically have to comb through all these questions. And a lot of times, you know, we think of these comments coming from the public. They're not, you know, sometimes they're just kind of from random citizens. That actually does happen quite a bit, but a lot of substantive comments are usually coming from certain types of organizations. So obviously, you know, for something like a ZEV mandate or CAFE, you're going to get lots of input from the automakers themselves, and they'll have some, you know, pushback or questions, that sort of thing. You're going to get input from researchers and scientists, right, from national labs, from universities. You can get input from nonprofit organizations, from environmental justice advocacy groups. So there's a whole sort of slew of different stakeholders who have some kind of involvement with the regulation, and the comment period is the kind of moment in time where people can kind of chime in and say, hey, you know, this rulemaking that you guys have announced makes a lot of sense, or it doesn't make a lot of sense, and for these reasons, and so on. And actually, when the regulatory agency gets all these comments back, they are required by law to address all of them. It doesn't mean that they have to change the regulation based off of comments. They just have to say, hey, we looked at this, and we're either going to say, you know, we're going to dismiss it, or hey, you know, we think that this makes sense and we're going to change the regulation in certain ways. And it can be a big big lift for these regulatory agencies to basically go through all of these comments. And then deregulation gets finalized. The agency will release a final rule, which is the sort of updated version from the initial rulemaking after the public comments have been received and taken into account. And that becomes a law, and that has the same sort of force of law as something that goes through your sort of main legislative body. And so the ZAV regulation that you guys had covered on Monday is one of the sort of premier regulations involving electric vehicles within California, and obviously with some of the other states as well. And today we'll talk about one of the big other regulations affecting car technology over the last couple decades. And the last thing that I'll quickly mention about this is that actually these two processes can actually be tied together. Sometimes a legislative body can actually direct regulatory agencies to make a new regulation, right? And this gets to some of the nuance behind, hey, why is it that we even have a legislative body and a regulatory agency? Why don't we just have one group do everything, right? So unfortunately the legislators, elected officials might not have the sort of capacity to have the sort of knowledge necessary to make these sort of highly detailed regulations. That's why we have sort of specialized agencies that are delving into these issues. But it is possible for them to direct the regulatory agencies to make regulations for sort of specific topics. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of different regulatory agencies in the US. This is just a sort of small sampling of some of the ones that maybe you guys are familiar with or have heard of, right? FDA, USDA, OSHA, Homeland Security. Okay, these guys are all regulatory agencies that operate under the executive branch. And then the ones that we'll mainly be focused on today are going to be these bottom guys here, the US DOT and the US EPA. And actually this one up in the top right, the National Transportation, oh no, that's NTSB, that's not NHTSA, sorry. So there's a sort of sub group within the DOT, NHTSA, which is actually one of the agencies that we've talked about in previous lectures, who is responsible for the CAFE standards. Okay. So feel free, everyone, to either speak up if you have any questions. You can raise your hand as well, or you could just type a question directly in chat, either just to me or publicly to everyone. I'll be keeping my eye out, or I'll be doing my best to keep my eye out. So let's talk about the CAFE standards. So CAFE stands for the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards. So back in the 1970s, there was this big oil crisis in the early 1970s. And as a response, Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act in 1975. And this was a way to kind of try and reduce essentially dependence on foreign oil so that the kind of oil crisis that was happening would be could be avoided in the future. So this involved things like increasing domestic energy production and supply, reducing energy demand, increasing energy efficiency, and having more ways to deal with disruptions in the energy supply. And so the corporate average fuel economy standards is specifically kind of focused on this third bullet, right? By increasing energy efficiency, you can let people drive their cars in the same way that they did before, but you would reduce the overall amount of oil that would be required. So as I was mentioning, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which we kind of shortened as NHTSA, was the sort of department with, or the sub-department within the DOT that is meant to enforce compliance of these standards. Okay, so this is a graph of, I would say, sort of the historical CAFE standards up to, I would say, around like 2012, 2013-ish time period, which is actually back when I made this graph. It needs to be updated, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has happened since then, but we'll talk about that when we get to sort of the modern stuff. But here, this is a look at essentially how the fuel efficiency standards have looked like historically. So let's kind of walk through this plot here. So on the x-axis, this is over time, and then on the y-axis, we have actually grams of CO2 per mile, which is directly correlated with MPG. Right, this is the whole MPG illusion thing that we've talked about before. So it's a 1/x thing, which is why this is nonlinear in its scale. So usually you have increasing MPG, right? So this is reversed, going from low to high instead of high to low. So you're going from low MPG down to high MPG. I have this grams of CO2 per mile on the y-axis on the left side, even though CAFE standards are specifically meant to be in MPG, but we'll get to why these units are being used a little bit later on. But here you can see the general trend. Okay, so there's a separate standard for trucks, and then there's a separate standard for passenger cars. Okay, I see a quick comment. Can I share the source for this plot? Yeah, so this actually comes from this annual like aggregate data thing that NHTSA publishes that basically gives the numbers for all of these lines. I can dig up I'll dig up the link and I can share it with everyone. The green line is the combined between the red and the blue, although the green isn't like a real actual number. This is more for sort of tracking purposes. There is no requirement for a combined standard. They're separated. So trucks are allowed to essentially have a lower MPG than cars, as you can see. So the red is always above the blue. And that was implemented shortly after, right? So standards were set for passenger vehicles in '78. Standards were set for light duty trucks in '79. One of the things that you'll notice is that this line from about 1990 all the way to 2010 is completely flat. And that is, you know, across a couple sort of administrations, they decided that fuel economy didn't need to be improved, essentially. And that's going to play a sort of big role in the way that a lot of the sort of modern day standards ended up getting improved. There was a sort of big movement to change this sort of at the end of Bush Jr.'s administration, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is that these standards are a requirement for the sort of aggregate fleet of cars being produced by an automaker, not for an individual car. Okay, so if I were to, let me actually go back for a second. Let's say I go back here and I look here and see that, hey, in 2012, you know, let's say Ford has to have 35 MPG cars here. That does not mean that all of their cars need to be 35 MPG. It means that the average sales weighted fuel efficiency for every manufacturer needs to reach that target. Okay, and so if a manufacturer, so let's do a quick sort of simple calculation. If a manufacturer sells 10 20 mile per gallon cars and they sell 10 30 mile per gallon cars, what do you guys think would be the average fuel economy of the cars that manufacturer sells? What do you guys think? You can just shout it out or type it in the chat. Yeah, so it's actually a bit, yes, it is a bit of a trick question. It's the same thing as the MPG illusion. You have to do the harmonic averages because dealing with MPG is really kind of silly. So the way this works is you do 10 over, so 10 cars of 20 MPG plus 10 cars over 30 MPG, instead of 10 times 20 and 10 times 30 would be equal to 20 cars divided by X MPG, and X ends up being equal to 24 miles per gallon. So it's actually less than 25. Yeah, so just one thing to keep in mind as we sort of think about this. If you end up doing the regular average, it'll overestimate what the actual MPG should be. Yeah, so I see a question. Can you take the arithmetic mean of gallons per mile? Yes, you can. So if you convert to gallons per mile from miles per gallon, then you can simply do the regular old arithmetic mean. Also, one quick thing to mention, what MPGs are we talking about here? So when we talked about the lecture on efficiencies, right, there's a whole bunch of different efficiencies that we can use. So the numbers that are being used for CAFE are actually based off of the 2-cycle test. And so a lot of these are going to be, if I hop back here, it's saying that, hey, by 2020, we're going to be close to like 50 mpg on average for all cars. But if you do the that's the 2-cycle measurement, in reality that's probably going to be close to like 35 to 40 miles per gallon per vehicle. So a little bit different. The MPG number should be scaled down a little bit because you're using these 2-cycle numbers. Okay, so when an automaker complies with the rules, they basically generate credits based off of their target. So this is kind of similar in some ways to the ZEB regulation, where there's also this kind of credit system. And like the ZEB regulation, credits for automakers can be traded between different automakers, and they can also be banked. So if you over comply in certain years, then you can hold on to those credits and use them later, or you can trade them away for money. And historically, there hadn't been much sort of trading. A lot of automakers have mainly been banking them. And as a sort of general, so I haven't looked at this sort of recently, but as a general rule of thumb, historically, what we had seen is that Asian automakers tended to over comply, which means, if there's an MPG target, they tend to do better than that, which means that they accumulate credits. American automakers tend to be right around the actual standard requirements. And then European automakers tended to be sort of under compliant and therefore having to pay penalties. A lot of these European automakers are sort of more luxury brands. So you can think of like, Porsche and BMW and that sort of thing. And because their cars have this sort of higher premium, the automakers are sometimes like willing to pay these penalties as a way of not having to reduce the sort of performance aspects of like some of their nicer sort of higher end luxury vehicles and that sort of thing. So here you can see the way that a penalty is paid is based off of civil penalties, which is a $55 penalty per 1 mpg that the compliance is out per vehicle. So for example, if I am Mercedes-Benz and I sell, let's say 100,000 vehicles, and the target is like 30 mpg, but I'm at 29 mpg. So there's a 1 mpg difference. And so I would have to pay $55 times 100,000 vehicles that I sold, right? And so I would pay $5.5 million in penalty for that violation. And so over a 30-year time period, as you can see here, you can see that automakers have paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. So there's a good question here. What's stopping car makers from just adding $55 to the selling price of each vehicle? There isn't, right? Like that's something that they could do, and they probably have done in the past. It's not like they're explicitly doing it with this thing where it's like, hey, it's going to cost us this much, so you like tack on this like extra dollar. It's more that like the premium of these vehicles is large enough to kind of accommodate the fact that they're paying this penalty. But basically, yeah, for all intents and purposes, that's essentially what they're doing. And we'll talk about how that's going to change or how that changed a little bit in just a second. Okay, so that's kind of the basic rundown for how the system actually works. But there's a whole bunch of like very interesting stuff that happened over the last decade. And actually, this topic is kind of what I did a lot of my PhD research on when I was in grad school. So I had to learn a lot of this sort of history as I was doing my research as a PhD student. So you remember when I said the CAFE standards, they were like flat for a really long period of time. So California was essentially, they got fed up with this, right? So because the CAFE standards were frozen for like 20 years, starting with the Bush Senior administration, Senator Fran PAVLI decided to author this bill known as AB 1493, which is referred to as the PAVLI regulations, which basically required reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle tailpipes. There's this whole kind of fascinating thing about why California is allowed to do this. So if I'm gonna make, if you're gonna make automakers comply with a emissions regulation for cars, but then these cars are sold across different states, right? You are now going from state regulation to wandering into like federal regulation territory, right? So why is California allowed to do this? Back in the 1970s, when the Clean Air Act was passed, California actually had a Clean Air Act in place already. They had a preceding regulation to the federal one. And the federal one basically then said, hey, okay, California's rules are stricter than ours, so we're gonna let California do its own thing. And if other states want to join in with California, they can voluntarily do so. And any changes to sort of emissions regulations that are enabled under the Clean Air Act, California has to obtain a waiver that would allow them to then enforce those rules to all the other states that decided to join in on that. So this whole thing basically boils down to, it allows California to make their own sort of rules, even though this is kind of wandering into like federal territory. And so when PAVLI got passed, we had to get a waiver to be able to enforce it. And that first waiver was made in December of 2005 during George Bush Jr.'s administration. And that waiver was denied by the US EPA in March of 2008. Right, which is the last year of his administration. Okay, so put that on pause for a second. We're going to come back to this. Right around the same time, there's another sort of really interesting thing that's happening. So when we think about the Clean Air Act, right, this is think back to our lecture about greenhouse gases versus local air pollutants. Local air pollutants are these things that are causing respiratory damages, local health effects, that sort of thing. And we know those are all sort of these well-established effects. And there is this question that of whether or not the Environmental Protection Agency should only be addressing local air pollutants, or if they should also be addressing greenhouse gases. So there was this famous court case back in 2007 that went all the way to the Supreme Court, basically arguing that the EPA should regulate CO2, right? A greenhouse gas. And Massachusetts was leading this case, but it was sort of alongside 11 other states. And they basically sued the EPA to determine whether EPA had the legal authority to regulate CO2. And the outcome of that court case was that not only did EPA have the ability to do that, but they were required to. And so this was a sort of landmark case for basically requiring CO2 emissions to be regulated at the EPA. So now we're all sort of coming to a head. You've got the US DOT in charge of the CAFE standards, the US EPA having to now make some kind of CO2 standards for vehicles, right? And we do know that CO2 and miles per gallon are directly connected. And then you've got California doing their own thing to make a set of standards. And so Obama gets elected at the end of 2008, and immediately what happens is they grant the waiver that California had been asking about, that would then allow California to have their own set of CO2 standards for their vehicles. And so CARB is going to make a set of regulations. US DOT already has the CAFE standards, and then the EPA is going to make a different set of standards. So basically what ends up happening is that a whole bunch of automakers, there's a huge pushback, a unified pushback across a bunch of different automakers, that it would be crazy for them to like try and make cars specific for California and then have to deal with like 2 different federal regulations. It would be way too difficult and costly, which is probably a fair argument. And so what ends up happening is the administration brings everyone to the table and says, okay, you guys want to, if you don't want 3 different standards, you have to come together and agree on this sort of thing. So EPA and NHTSA essentially agree to harmonize the standards so that the grams of CO2 per mile and the MPG requirements match up. They're synced between EPA's regulation, which is known as the Greenhouse Gas Emission Standards, and the US DOT's CAFE standards. And California agrees not to pursue their own rules under the PAVLI regulation. But it was actually really important that California was at the table because they had a lot of leverage here. They had the ability to influence a lot of the rulemaking, basically forcing EPA and NHTSA to set the standards a lot higher than they otherwise would have been had California not been at the table. Because then they basically are saying, hey, if you guys don't make these rules strict enough, we're just going to make our own, and you guys can do your own thing, and which is right. That's not what anyone wanted. So CARB is able to influence the rulemaking even without implementing their own set of rules. So this is where the sort of famous, well, this was probably well known in automaker circles at the time. You had to get 55 mpg essentially by 2025. And it was later sort of modified down to 52 mpg. But anyways, you had this sort of one national program, everyone agreed. I wouldn't say automakers were like thrilled, but basically they were on board. It wasn't, a lot of the sentiment around that time went from sort of, hey, we don't want to do this, like, please don't do this, blah, 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 to more like, okay, like, we accept this, how do we go about doing this? We're gonna have to like gear up to improve fuel efficiency and modify the vehicles over a period of 10 years to meet these requirements. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that there are kind of limits to how long agencies are able to regulate certain laws. And so specifically for NHTSA, they aren't allowed to regulate for 14 years. So the regulation was split into 2 phases. And there are all these other things that are like midterm reviews that kind of have to allow the regulation to be reviewed and updated, which is going to come into an important point in just a moment, because you'll notice that the first phase, 2016, ends with the end of the Obama administration. So there's going to be some important things that happen there. And I wanted to get back to Matthew's point. Okay, what's to stop car makers from just adding these penalties to the price of each vehicle? So the old CAFE standards, they have these penalties, and you could argue that they weren't all that stringent. But the interesting thing is that whereas the NHTSA CAFE standards are civil penalties, this $55 per mpg per vehicle, EPA standards are, those penalties are way crazier. So you can actually have criminal liability, right? Because you're actually affecting health and that sort of thing. And their purview is, EPA's purview actually allows them to do criminal penalties. And those penalties were way crazier. It was like thousands of dollars per car per day that you're out of compliance. So if you were violating things in the same way, you could be facing, instead of like millions of dollars per year in penalty, you could be facing millions of dollars every single day that you're out of compliance. So that was one thing that automakers were pretty worried about at the time. And so this combined thing, this one national program, definitely had much stronger teeth than before. One other kind of difference that happened is that the regulation was updated based off of the vehicle footprint. Okay, so let me describe what the footprint is. This is the wheelbase times the track width. So you can think of basically the footprint as defining the area between the wheels. And so now the standards are footprint based, which means essentially what all this means is, like, if you look at a single line here, it means that the larger the footprint of the vehicle, essentially the larger the vehicle itself, the more, the less stringent the standard would be. So if you were a car company that sold, okay, the best way to think about this is, like, if you were a car company that only sold like Mini Coopers, you would have to, maybe you would have regulation where in a certain year, you'd be having to do 35 mpg. Whereas if you were a car company that sold only, Ford F-150s, then your average would only need to be, let's say 20 mpg, right? Even if you sold the same number of cars in the same year. And so there's this like weird incentive for automakers to actually make their cars a little bit bigger, because it makes the fuel economy standards easier to meet. And we actually ended up, we did end up seeing that happen, was that the footprints of vehicles ended up getting larger. So even if the vehicle itself didn't get bigger, like the wheels themselves would get spaced apart, as a way of making it easier to meet these regulations. These are just some of the unintended consequences of the way that the regulation is specified. Okay. So this system is kind of like logical for gas cars. You have fuel economy and emission rates that are tied together, right? We can go from 55 mpg to 160 grams of CO2 per mile, right, via the 8,887 grams of CO2 per gallon, right? This is the way that we can convert between these two, and there's this like direct relationship, right? This is no longer that straightforward for alternative fuel vehicles, right? Because on the efficiency side, okay, I can measure that pretty easily. But then on the emission side, this is like super crazy complicated, right? We've talked about how you calculate emissions from electric vehicles. And it's not straightforward, like even amongst researchers, we don't agree like the best way to calculate them. So this has been kind of brushed under the table, essentially. The way that it's dealt with right now, and will continue to be dealt with in the future, actually, as all the way up till now, and for at least the next couple of years, there are these things known as weights and multipliers, which are meant to kind of incentivize electric vehicles being produced for automakers. And okay, it's a little bit more complicated. I'm going to kind of cut through some of this stuff. I'm just going to tell you that the way this works is like for a BEV, there's a weighting factor of 0. Essentially, all that means is that you have 0 grams of CO2 emitted. It doesn't count any of the upstream stuff. It's just looking at the tailpipe. Okay, and there are pros and cons to doing it this way, but that's basically how it's done right now. It does simplify the regulation a lot, but one of the drawbacks is that the regulation doesn't differentiate between different types of electric vehicles. And so improving efficiency of an electric vehicle no longer kind of really helps you, at least in the greenhouse gas emission standards, right? There's no incentive for automakers to improve efficiency for EVs like there is for gas cars. And that efficiency difference is already pretty big. The Jaguar I-Pace has 44 kilowatt hours per 100 miles, whereas the Hyundai Ioniq has 25 kilowatt hours per 100 miles. So the I-Pace consumes 76% more energy, but these vehicles are basically considered to be the same under the greenhouse gas emission standards. I'm actually going to skip through this slide. We won't worry about that. So going back to some of the recent history of CAFE. So remember, as I was mentioning, there's this kind of midterm review for the interim phases of CAFE. And for the 2021 to 2025 time period, the review of that was set to happen in 2017. So remember, at the beginning of the lecture today, I talked about the sort of 3 things that need to happen for regulation. So you announce the rulemaking, and they publish an initial rule. There's a public commenting period lasting several months, and then the final rule gets announced. So what happens at the end of 2016? So Trump gets elected as president, and Obama EPA, or the EPA under Obama's administration, promptly, several months early, announced the proposed rule in December of 2016. And then they gave 1 week for public comments, right? And this is usually a several month-long process. So everyone's panicking at this point. Automakers, and other sort of environmental NGOs, researchers were all like, oh my gosh, the rules came out all of a sudden, and we have like 1 week to make these comments, even though normally we would have several months, to be able to read through the regulation, understand what's going on, and make sort of these educated comments. And then, so everyone scrambled together to make comments on the regulation. And then, like a couple days later, they announced the final rule, which was like, usually it takes a couple months to go through all of the comments. They basically said, hey, we looked at all the comments, and we think that the final rule is good as is. So the final rule ends up getting released before Trump can take office. So there's definitely a little bit of like sketchiness there, but they were kind of preparing for the worst, in the sense that like the Republican administration probably would want to really tone down the rules or get rid of them entirely. So sliding this in before they could kind of change anything was their way of maybe trying to get around that, or I would say that there's some kind of like political strategy here too, because things that happen in the last period, regulations that get passed in the sort of last period are actually subject to being overturned by the new executive. So there was probably a pretty good sense that this was gonna get overturned, but it actually allowed them to strategize ways to basically combat any new regulation that might be coming out of Trump's administration. So kind of unsurprisingly, the new administration wanted to get rid of the CAFE regulation, but there are some institutional barriers. They have to go through a new rulemaking process to kind of overturn the last one, and there'd be sort of substantial resistance from a lot of different communities, including the automakers. So it's not to necessarily say that automakers were sort of all on board with the rules that happened under Obama's administration. I think a lot of them would probably prefer generally regulations, less tight regulations. But I think one thing that automakers want sort of above all, even despite the sort of stringency of the regulation, is stability of regulation. You don't want to have to completely change your planning process every 4 years where there's a new sort of administration. So there are definitely big differences of opinions even amongst the automakers themselves about whether they should be supporting Trump or the sort of old rules. So what ended up happening was the Trump administration, the EPA passed, or the DOT passed the Safer, Affordable, Fuel Efficient rule, called the SAFE rule, which is the sort of updated CAFE standards for 2021 to 2025. And basically the proposal was to freeze standards starting in 2021. And a lot of the justification for these changes were based off of these like really wild assumptions, like faster turnover, reduced carbon prices for benefits, increased technology costs. And there was a huge kind of pushback of a lot of these assumptions. This is a sort of famous paper that got published by a bunch of economists in Science, which is one of the top academic journals, where they were showing what the benefits versus costs were in the old way that these things were calculated, and you could see that there were more sort of benefits than costs. And then with the updated regulation, the Trump administration was saying, okay, the benefits versus costs look something more like this. And they basically were kind of tearing apart a lot of the assumptions that were being made here. So yeah, there were kind of a lot of it was kind of a wild time for a lot of people involved in the regulation at this time, kind of trying to combat the lowering of the standards by the Trump administration. So California, they made good or prepared to make good on their original threat from 10 years ago, where they said, okay, if you guys are going to do this, we're going to come up with our own standards. And so they went about preparing to do this. But remember that in order for California to be able to do this, that they would have to get a waiver from the EPA to enact their own rules. And under the Trump administration, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not this would happen, right? Almost certainly the waiver would get denied. And so when we were thinking about this, the expectation in the community was that, okay, this is going to go to court, but we don't really know, there's no precedent for this. Like, we don't know if the courts are going to rule in favor of California being able to get the waiver or not. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But turns out CARB is really smart. They basically went to a bunch of automakers and they were like, hey, we're going to do this. There's going to be a big fight. We don't know how this is going to go. This is going to introduce a ton of uncertainty into your product design, planning process, right? And so they were like, how about you guys just voluntarily agree to whatever we say? And a bunch of automakers did that. So Ford, Honda, BMW, Volkswagen, and Volvo voluntarily agreed to whatever standards that California was going to come up with, preemptively kind of bypassing the need for California to even come up with this waiver. There were a couple companies that did not want to do that. So notably, GM, Chrysler, and Toyota sided with Trump. But this represented, a pretty novel strategy to get around these waiver requirements. Fortunately, things kind of turned out for the better once Biden ended up getting elected. The SAFE rule did end up getting passed in the final year of Trump's administration. On March 31st, SAFE was passed. The fuel efficiency improvements weren't frozen in 2020. They actually were decreased to go up by 1.5% per year instead of under the Obama rule, which would have been 5% per year. So it's better than nothing. But basically, in a similar manner to what was done with Obama's rules, once Biden came in, they were quickly overturned. In December of last year, the SAFE rule ended up getting repealed. And there was a new rulemaking proposal for CAFE standards from 2024 to 2026 that increased stringency at an 8% rate, much higher compared to the 1.5% in SAFE. And as of actually even since after the class started, April of 2022, the new standards were announced, and the targets look something like this, with the overall fleet going up to 50 mpg, passenger cars being up as high as 60 mpg, essentially by 2026. So yeah, I don't know why the table includes post 2026, but these are the kind of main numbers to look at here. Yeah, and so these are gonna be estimated to reduce fuel use by 200 billion gallons to 2050. And they're much more in line with the Obama era standards. Yeah, and so kind of going back and tying this to electric vehicles, this is a whole kind of fascinating sort of political tie-in to the development of the policy. And I would definitely say that the regulations here are not so much driving electric vehicle adoption as the regulation that you guys talked about on Monday, the ZEV regulation. They're not as stringent as, for example, the European Union standards, which we will cover on Monday, because the standards here can theoretically actually be satisfied with gas cars, but in the EU, you actually need electric vehicles to even meet the standards. But the EVs certainly make it a lot easier for automakers to meet the requirements. When we've talked to automakers in the past, it's definitely been the case that electric vehicle production is more driven by the ZEV regulation than by the CAFE standards. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. But as the CAFE standards ramp up more and more in stringency, the electric vehicles may in the future become a necessity. for them to meet those requirements. And then these main points that I was talking about as they relate to EVs with the CAFE standards, they're considered no tailpipe emissions. And so that may change in the future. And if it does, you know, there's this question of like, how do you actually count those emissions and what would be a fair way of doing that? And it's a fairly sort of complex question. And to me, it makes a lot of sense that they're, you know, I don't want to call them out to say that they're like avoiding it, but, you know, they're putting it's not a sort of priority for them right now to make those kind of determinations. It probably makes a lot more sense once you have way more EVs on the road. And then the last thing that I'll say is that at some point, again, it'll probably be important to account for efficiencies of EVs, right? All EVs are kind of treated equally under the EPA requirements. And so there should be some kind of incentive for automakers to improve those efficiencies. Yeah, and so I'm gonna end here for today. Hopefully that was a interesting dive into the sort of policy and the politics behind a lot of these policies for CAFE. And hopefully you can also see how this is playing some role in the way that EVs are being developed, but probably not as much as the ZAB regulations that will be happening moving on into the future. Okay, let me stop recording.